Hello, I'm Dr. Dale McGee, and I'm going to read to you Morris's Disappearing Bag by Rosemary Wells, my granddaughter Caroline's favorite book. It was Christmas morning. Wow, said Morris. Morris's brother Victor got a hockey outfit. Morris's sister Rose got a beauty kit. Morris's other sister Betty got a chemistry set. And Morris got a bear. All Christmas Day, Victor played hockey, and Rose made herself beautiful, and Betty mixed acids. And then Betty made herself beautiful, and Victor sorted the test tubes, and Rose played left wing. And then Victor made himself beautiful, and Betty played goalie, and Rose invented a new gas. Morris was too young to play with chemicals, said Betty. He might blow up the house. He was too little to play hockey, said Victor. He might get hurt. And he was too silly to use the beauty kit, said Rose. He would waste all of the lipstick. Nobody wanted Morris's bear. Come, said Morris's mother. Let's make a hat for your bear. No, said Morris. Let's take your bear for a walk, suggested Morris's father. No, said Morris. Morris wouldn't eat his dinner. What's the matter with Morris? Asked his father. I think he's hit himself with a hockey puck, said Victor. Maybe he ate the lipstick, said Rose. It was the gas, said Betty. He breathed it in. Morris sat under the Christmas tree, and suddenly he noticed a package that had been overlooked. He opened it, and in it was a disappearing bag. Morris crawled right in. Morris, said Victor. Right here, said Morris. Where? Asked Victor. Where's Morris? Asked Betty and Rose. Over here, said Morris. But they couldn't find him. Maybe he blew himself up, said Betty. Do you suppose he's so beautiful we wouldn't recognize him? Asked Rose. Dad, shouted Victor, Morris is skating so fast we can't see him. Morris came out of his bag. Where were you? Asked Victor. I was in my disappearing bag, said Morris. I want to use it, shouted Victor. Me first, said Rose. You can use my chemicals, said Betty. Morris held open his bag. Everybody disappeared at once. Then he zoomed, and he mixed, and he beautified until bedtime. Bedtime, said Morris. May I use the bag tomorrow? Asked Rose. I want to sleep in it tonight, said Betty. Morris, said Victor, I hope you remember where you put the bag. But Morris was already fast asleep.
Hi, I'm Erin Canzano, and this is The Christmas Day Kitten by James Herriot. Christmas can never go by without my remembering a certain little cat. I first saw her when I called to see one of Mrs. Pickering's much-loved basset hounds. I looked in some surprise at the furry creature moving quietly down the hall. I didn't know you had a cat, I said to Mrs. Pickering, who was a plumpish, pleasant-faced woman. Mrs. Pickering smiled. We haven't really. Debbie is a stray. She comes here 2 or 3 times a week, and we give her some food. I don't know where she lives. Do you ever get the feeling that she wants to stay with you? I asked. No, Mrs. Pickering shook her head. She's a timid little thing. Just creeps in, has some food, then slips away. She doesn't seem to want to let me help her in any way. I looked at the little tabby cat again. But isn't she just having food today? It's a funny thing, but every now and again she pops through into the sitting room and sits by the fire for a few minutes. It's as though she was giving herself a treat. The little cat was sitting very upright on the thick rug, which lay in front of the fireplace, in which the coals glowed and flamed. The 3 Bassets were already lying there, but they seemed used to Debbie. 2 of them sniffed her in a bored manner, and the 3rd merely cocked a sleepy eye at her before flopping back to sleep. Debbie made no effort to curl up or wash herself or do anything other than gaze quietly ahead. This was obviously a special event in her life, a treat. Then suddenly she turned and crept from the room without a sound and was gone. "That's just the way it is with Debbie," said Mrs. Pickering, laughing. "She never stays more than 10 minutes or so. Then she's off." I often visited the Pickering home, and I always looked out for the little cat. On one occasion, I spotted her nibbling daintily from a saucer at the kitchen door. As I watched, she turned and almost floated on light footsteps into the hall, then through into the sitting room. Debbie settled herself in the middle of the pile of Basset hounds in her usual way, upright, still, and gazing into the glowing fire. This time I tried to make friends with her, but she leaned away as I stretched out my hand. However, I talked to her softly, and I managed to stroke her cheek with one finger. Then it was time for her to go, and once outside the house, she jumped up onto the stone wall and down the other side. The last I saw was the little tabby figure flitting away across the grass field. "I wonder where she goes," I murmured. "That's something we've never been able to find out," said Mrs. Pickering. It was 3 months later that I next heard from Mrs. Pickering, and it happened to be Christmas morning. "I'm so sorry to bother you today, of all days," said Mrs. Pickering apologetically. "Don't worry at all," I said. "Which of the dogs needs attention?" "It's not the dogs. It's Debbie. She's come to the house, and there's something very wrong. Please come quickly." I drove through the empty market square. The snow was thick on the road and on the roofs of the surrounding houses. The shops were closed, but the pretty colored lights of the Christmas trees winked in the windows. Mrs. Pickering's house was beautifully decorated with tinsel and holly, and the rich smell of turkey and sage and onion stuffing wafted from the kitchen. But she had a very worried look on her face as she led me through to the sitting room. Debbie was there, but she wasn't sitting upright in her usual fashion. She was lying quite still, and huddled close to her lay a tiny kitten. I looked down in amazement. "What have we got here?" "It's the strangest thing," Mrs. Pickering replied. "I haven't seen her for several weeks, and then she came in about 2 hours ago, staggered into the kitchen, and she was carrying the kitten in her mouth. She brought it in here and laid it on the rug. Almost immediately, I could see that she wasn't well. Then she lay down like this, and she hasn't moved since." I knelt on the rug and passed my hand over Debbie's body, which Mrs. Pickering had placed on a piece of sheet. She was very, very thin, and her coat was dirty. I knew that she didn't have long to live. "Is she ill, Mr. Harriet?" asked Mrs. Pickering in a trembling voice. Yes, I'm afraid so, but I don't think she is in any pain." Mrs. Pickering looked at me, and I saw there were tears in her eyes. Then she knelt down beside Debbie and stroked the cat's head while the tears fell into the dirty fur. "Oh, the poor little thing. I should have done more for her." I spoke gently. "Nobody could have done more than you. Nobody could have been kinder. And see, she has brought her kitten to you, hasn't she?" "Yes, you are right, she has." Mrs. Pickering reached out and lifted up the tiny, bedraggled kitten. "Isn't it strange? Debbie knew she was dying, so she brought her kitten here, and on Christmas Day." I bent down and put my hand on Debbie's heart. There was no beat. "I'm afraid she has died." I lifted the feather-light body, wrapped it in the piece of sheet, and took it out to the car. When I came back, Mrs. Pickering was still stroking the kitten. The tears had dried, and she was bright-eyed as she looked at me. "I've never had a cat before," she said. I smiled. "Well, it looks as if you got one now." And she certainly had. The kitten grew rapidly into a sleek, handsome, and bouncy tabby cat, and Mrs. Pickering called him Buster. He wasn't timid like his little mother, and he lived like a king, and with the ornate collar he always wore, looked like one too. I watched him grow up with delight, but on the occasion that always stays in my mind was the following Christmas Day, a year after his arrival. I was on my way home after visiting a farmer with a sick cow, and I was looking forward to my Christmas dinner. Mrs. Pickering was at her front door when I passed her house, and I heard her call out, "Merry Christmas, Mr. Harriet. Come in and have a drink to warm up." I had a little time to spare, so I stopped the car and went in. In the house, there was all the festive cheer of last year and the same glorious whiff of sage and onion stuffing. But this year, there was no sorrow. There was Buster. He was darting up to each of the basset hounds in turn, ears pricked, eyes twinkling, dabbing a paw at them, and then streaking away. Mrs. Pickering laughed. Buster does tease them so. He gives them no peace. She was right. For a long time, the dogs had led a rather sedate life. Gentle walks with their mistress, plenty of good food, and long snoring sessions on the rugs and armchairs. Then Buster arrived. He was now dancing up to the youngest dog again, head on one side, asking him to play. When he started boxing with both paws, it was too much for the Basset, who rolled over with the cat in a wrestling game. Come into the garden, said Mrs. Pickering. I want to show you something. She lifted a hard rubber ball from the sideboard, and we went outside. She threw the ball across the lawn, and Buster bounded after it, over the frosty grass, his tabby coat gleaming in the sun. He seized the ball in his mouth, brought it back to his mistress, dropped it at her feet, and waited. Mrs. Pickering threw it again, and again Buster brought it back. I gasped. A retriever cat. Bassets looked on unimpressed. Nothing would ever make them chase a ball, but Buster did it again and again, as though he would never tire of it. Mrs. Pickering turned to me. Have you ever seen anything like that? No, I replied. He is a most remarkable cat. We went back into the house where she held Buster close to her, laughing as the big cat purred loudly. Looking at him so healthy and contented, I remembered his mother, who had carried her tiny kitten to the only place of comfort and warmth that she had ever known. Mrs. Pickering was thinking the same thing, because she turned to me, and although she was smiling, her eyes were thoughtful. Debbie would be pleased, she said. I nodded. Yes, she would. It was just a year ago today she brought him in, wasn't it? That's right. She hugged Buster again. The best Christmas present I've ever had. The end.
I'm John Wensky, and I'm going to read How the Grinch Stole Christmas by Dr. Seuss. Every Who down in Whoville liked Christmas a lot. But the Grinch, who lived just north of Whoville, did not. The Grinch hated Christmas, the whole Christmas season. Now, please don't ask why. No one quite knows the reason. It could be his head wasn't screwed on just right. It could be, perhaps, that his shoes were too tight. But I think that most likely reason of all may have been that his heart was 2 sizes too small. But whatever the reason, his heart or his shoes, he stood there on Christmas Eve hating the Whos, staring down from his cave with a sour, grinchy frown at the warm lighted windows below in their town. For he knew every Who down in Whoville beneath was busy now hanging a mistletoe wreath. And they're hanging their stockings, he snarled with a sneer. Tomorrow is Christmas. It's practically here. Then he growled, with his Grinch fingers nervously drumming, I must find some way to stop Christmas from coming. For tomorrow, he knew, all the Who girls and boys who would make bright and early, they'd rush for their toys, and then, oh, the noise. Oh, the noise, 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 noise. That's one thing he hated, the noise, 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 noise. Then the Whos, young and old, would sit down to a feast, and they'd feast, and they'd feast, and they'd feast, 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 feast. They would feast on Who pudding and rare Who roast beast, which was something the Grinch couldn't stand in the least. And then they'd do something he'd like least of all. Every Who down in Whoville, the tall and the small, would stand close together with Christmas bells ringing. They'd stand hand in hand, and the Whos would start singing. They'd sing, and they'd sing, and they'd sing, 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 sing. And the more the Grinch thought of this Who Christmas sing, the more the Grinch thought, I must stop this whole thing. Why, for 53 years I've put up with it now. I must stop this Christmas from coming, but how? Then he got an idea, an awful idea. The Grinch got a wonderful, awful idea. I know just what to do, the Grinch laughed in his throat, and he made a quick Santa Claus hat and a coat. And he chuckled and clucked. What a great Grinchy trick! With this coat and this hat, I look just like Saint Nick. All I need is a reindeer, the Grinch looked around, but since reindeer are scarce, there was none to be found. Did that stop the old Grinch? No. The Grinch simply said, if I can't find a reindeer, I'll make one instead. So he called his dog Max. Then he took some red thread, and he tied a big horn on the top of his head. Then he loaded some bags and some old empty sacks and a ramshackle sleigh, and he hitched it up to old Max. Then the Grinch said, get up, and the sleigh started down toward the homes where the Who's lay a snooze in their town. All their windows were dark. Quiet snow filled the air. All the Who's were dreaming sweet dreams without care. When he came to the first little house on the square, this is stop number 1, the old Grinchy Claus hissed, and he climbed to the roof, empty bags in his fist. Then he slid down the chimney, a rather tight pinch, but if Santa could do it, then so could the Grinch. He got stuck only once for a moment or two. Then he stuck his head out of the fireplace flue, where the little Who stockings all hung in a row. These stockings, he grinned, are the first things to go. Then he slithered and slunk with a smile most unpleasant around the whole room, and he took every present, pop guns and bicycles, roller skates, drums, checkerboards, tricycles, popcorns, and plums. And he stuffed them in bags. Then the Grinch very nimbly stuffed all the bags one by one up the chimney. Then he slunk to the icebox. He took the Who's feast. He took the Who pudding. He took the roast beast. He cleaned out the icebox as quick as a flash. Why, that Grinch even took their last can of Who hash. Then he stuffed all the food up the chimney with glee. And now, grinned the Grinch, I will stuff up the tree. And the Grinch grabbed the tree, and he started to shove, when he heard a small sound like the coo of a dove. He turned around fast, and he saw a small Who, little Cindy Lou who was not more than 2. The Grinch had been caught by this tiny Who daughter, who'd got out of bed for a cold cup of water. She stared at the Grinch and said, Santa Claus, why? Why are you taking our Christmas tree? Why? But you know, that old Grinch was so smart and so slick, he thought up a lie, and he thought it up quick. Why, my sweet little tot, the fake Santa Claus lied, there's a light on this tree that won't light on one side. So I'm taking it home to my workshop, my dear. I'll fix it up there, then I'll bring it back here. And his fib fooled the child, then he patted her head, and he got her a drink, and then sent her to bed. And when Cindy Lou Who went to bed with her cup, he went to the chimney and stuffed the tree up. Then the last thing he took was the log for their fire. Then he went up the chimney, himself an old liar. On the walls he left nothing but hooks and some wire. And the one speck of food that he left in the house was a crumb that was even too small for a mouse. Then he did the same thing to the other Who's houses, leaving crumbs much too small for the other Who's mouses. It was 1/4 dawn, all the Who's still abed, all the Who's still a snooze, when he packed up his sled, packed it up with their presents, the ribbons, the wrappings, the tags, and the tinsel, the trimmings and the trappings. 3,000 feet up the side of Mount Crumpet, he rode with his load to the tip-top to dump it. Pooh-pooh to the Who's, he was grinchiously humming. They're finding out now that no Christmas is coming. They're just waking up. I know just what they'll do. Their mouths will hang open a minute or two. Then the Who's down in Whoville will all cry boo-hoo. That's a noise, grinned the Grinch, that I simply must hear. So he paused, and the Grinch put his hand to his ear, and he did hear a sound rising over the snow. It started in low, then it started to grow. But the sound wasn't sad. Why, this sound sounded merry. It couldn't be so, but it was merry, very. He stared down at Whoville. The Grinch popped his eyes, then he shook. What he saw was a shocking surprise. Every Who down in Whoville, the tall and the small, was singing without any presents at all. He hadn't stopped Christmas from coming. It came. Somehow or other, it came just the same. And the Grinch, with his Grinch feet ice cold in the snow, stood puzzling and puzzling. How could it be so? It came without ribbons, it came without tags, it came without packages, boxes, or bags. And he puzzled 3 hours, till his puzzler was sore. Then the Grinch thought of something he hadn't before. Maybe Christmas, he thought, doesn't come from a store. Maybe Christmas, perhaps, means a little bit more. And what happened then? Well, in Whoville they say that the Grinch's small heart grew 3 sizes that day, and the minute his heart didn't feel quite so tight, he whizzed with his load through the bright morning light, and he brought back the toys and the food for the feast, and he himself, the Grinch, carved the roast beast.
It was Molly Mouse's first Christmas. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, and there was a tingle in the air. Through the window of a house, something was shining and glittering into the night. "What is that, Mom?" asked Molly. "It's a Christmas tree," said her mother. "People cover it with shiny balls, lights, and stars." "I wish we had a Christmas tree," sighed Molly. "Why don't you go into the woods to find one?" said her mother. "You could make it look just as nice as that tree in the window." Molly thought this was a great idea. She called her brothers and sisters together, and off they all scampered. On the way to the woods, they came to a barn. The mouse rummaged through it, looking for something to add to their tree. Under a big pile of hay, Molly found a doll. "This is like the doll on the top of the Christmas tree in the window," she said. "It will be just right for our tree." But the doll belonged to someone else. "Grr," said the old farm dog, "that's mine." "Don't chase us," cried Molly. "I only thought the doll would look nice on our Christmas tree." The old dog yawned. It was true that sometimes he chased mice, but because it was Christmas, or because he remembered the Christmas tree in the farmhouse and how he used to play with the children there, he said the mice could borrow the doll. The mice left the barn and walked across the barnyard carrying the doll. They came to the edge of the woods. "Hey," Molly shouted, "I see something else we can put on our Christmas tree." It was a gold ribbon hanging from the branch of an old oak tree. Molly scampered up the trunk, took hold of the ribbon, and pulled. But the ribbon belonged to a magpie. She had taken it to line her nest. "Please don't be angry," said Molly. "I only want the gold ribbon for our Christmas tree." Usually the magpie chased mice, but because it was Christmas, or because she had been admiring the Christmas tree in the window, she let go of the other end of the ribbon. Molly took the ribbon thankfully and ran. In the distance, Molly saw some shiny round things lying on the ground. They were like the shiny balls on the Christmas tree in the window. "Exactly what we want," cried Molly, running to pick one of them up. "Now we have a doll, a gold ribbon, and a shiny ball." But those shiny balls belong to a fox. "Those are my crab apples," he barked. "I'm saving them for the cold winter days ahead." "We only thought one would look good on our Christmas tree," Molly said, trembling. The fox sniffed. He chased mice most of the time, but because it was Christmas, or because he had never seen a Christmas tree before, he went back into the woods. Molly picked up a shiny crab apple and carried it away. Twilight was falling as the mice went deeper into the woods. At last they came to a clearing and found a large evergreen tree. "Our Christmas tree," cried Molly. On its branches they hung the doll, the ribbon, and the crabapple. "Oh," said Molly when they had finished, "it doesn't look like the tree I saw." Sadly, the mice turned away, disappointed, went all the way home to bed. In the middle of the night, Mother Mouse woke up Molly and her brothers and sisters. "Come with me," she whispered. "I have something to show you." The mice scurried along behind their mother into the woods. Sometimes other animals hurried on ahead of them. At last the mice reached the clearing. Molly stood completely still. Her eyes grew round and large. "Oh, look at that," she cried. During the night, the animals had all added more decorations to the Christmas tree, and the snow had come and touched everything with glitter. The little tree twinkled brightly in the darkness. "Our tree is even better than the one in the window," whispered Molly happily. And because it was Christmas, all the animals sat quietly around the tree, at peace with each other.
My name is Jason Palich, and I'm going to be reading Snow by Sam Usher. When I woke up this morning, it was snowing. I couldn't wait to go to the park. All I needed to do was dress, brush my teeth, put my shoes on, and get Granddad. We had to get outside in the snow before anyone else. I was ready to go, but Granddad wasn't. I said, "Don't forget about the snow." And he said, "Don't forget your scarf." So we weren't quick enough to be first. Granddad was taking forever, so I shouted, "All the others will get there first, Granddad. Don't forget about the snow." And Granddad said, "Don't forget your hat." So we weren't quick enough to go with my friends. Granddad was taking forever, so I shouted, "Hurry up, Granddad." And he said, "It's okay. We're not going to miss the fun." But we were. I told him all the cats and dogs were out there. Granddad laughed and said the whole zoo was probably out there. And then I saw something. I did. Finally, Granddad was ready. We headed to the park, where I could play in the snow at last. We played all the games you can play in the snow. Granddad won the snowball fight 6 slushings to 4. So I think he had fun too. Back at home, Granddad and I agreed that some things are definitely worth waiting for. I hope it snows again tomorrow. The end.